Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the Azaria Chamberlain case.
Oh, yeah.
A story that captivated Australia and the world. I mean, back in 1980.
It's just one of those stories. A 9-week-old baby vanishes from an outback campsite.
Right.
The mother claims a dingo took her. And it's just the sort of thing that taps into our primal fears and makes you question everything.
It really does.
Yeah.
And public opinion was completely divided. Some people bought the dingo story. Others were absolutely certain that Lindy Chamberlain was involved somehow.
Yeah, and that's what makes this case so fascinating. I mean, a dingo taking a baby, it sounds unbelievable.
It does.
It really forces us to look at the evidence, the behavior of dingoes, and how perception shapes our understanding of the truth.
Exactly. So our mission today is to sift through all the layers of this case, examine the key evidence, and see what we can learn decades later.
Yeah.
So to start, let's set the scene. The Chamberlains, Lindy, Michael, their 2 sons, and baby Azaria were on a camping trip at Uluru.
Yeah, and it was a pretty popular campsite. It had a communal barbecue area, social atmosphere, families gathering in the evenings.
Yeah. It was during one of these gatherings on August 17, 1980, that Azaria disappeared. She was sleeping in the family tent with one of her brothers, while the rest of the family was at that barbecue.
Yeah, another camper heard a baby cry coming from the tent. So Lindy went to check on Azaria, and as she approached the tent, she saw a dingo leaving, apparently carrying something in its mouth.
Wow. And her cry, "The dingo's got my baby," just became ingrained in the public consciousness. Immediately, a huge search began. Hundreds of people were involved. They found dingo tracks near the tent, but there was no sign of Azaria.
No. And then a few days later, they found some of Azaria's clothing, her jumpsuit, a torn nappy, but the baby herself was still missing, and this is where things get really complicated.
They do, because the condition of the clothing, the lack of a body, really fueled immediate skepticism.
Of course.
Could a dingo really have done this?
That was the central question. People were picturing pet dogs. They weren't understanding that dingoes are wild animals, apex predators in their environment.
Right, so let's dig into that a little. Are dingoes actually strong enough to carry off a baby? I mean, how big are we talking?
Well, they're not enormous, but they are powerful.
Okay.
And they've been known to prey on animals larger than themselves.
Right.
And there have also been documented cases of dingoes attacking humans.
Really?
Yeah, although thankfully fatalities are rare.
Oh, okay.
But this wasn't just any environment either, it was the outback.
Exactly.
So dingoes there have to be resourceful.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Food sources can be scarce, so a baby crying could be seen as potential prey. Now the question of the clothing, that's more complex. Experts are actually divided on whether a dingo could have removed the clothing so neatly.
Without causing more damage.
Yeah.
Well, I have read that dingoes sometimes peel the skin off their prey rather than tearing and ripping, so it's not completely out of the question.
Yeah, that's right. And what's really important to consider are the dingo attacks that happened after the initial Chamberlain trial. So there was a 13-month-old girl attacked on Fraser Island.
Oh, gosh.
She was thankfully rescued by her father. But these later cases with undeniable evidence of dingo attacks really challenged the assumptions a lot of people had about what a dingo was capable of.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, knowing what we know now about dingo behavior, the possibility of Azaria being taken by a dingo seems much more plausible
It does.
than it might have back then.
Absolutely. But let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the initial investigation. What kind of forensic evidence was presented at the first inquest?
Well, this is where the story takes a really controversial turn.
Okay.
So alleged blood was found in the Chamberlain's car, and there was expert testimony suggesting that Azaria's clothing had been cut, not torn.
But hold on. The defense actually disputed those findings, didn't they?
They did.
They had their own experts
They did.
to talk about the forensic evidence.
Absolutely. The defense presented their own experts who argued that the alleged blood was actually a sound-deadening compound used in the car.
Okay.
And the evidence about the clothing was highly contested. Some experts maintained were consistent with dingo teeth and claws.
So right from the beginning, there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding the forensic evidence.
Exactly. And importantly, a clear motive for Lindy Chamberlain to harm her baby was never established.
Right, that's a crucial point. The prosecution never presented a convincing reason why Lindy would have committed such a heinous act. But despite the uncertainties, public opinion had already hardened against the Chamberlain.
Yeah. And I think it's impossible to talk about this case without acknowledging the media frenzy that surrounded it. How did the media portray the Chamberlains?
Unfortunately, they were often depicted in a negative light, you know?
Right.
They were seen as cold, emotionless, almost suspicious in their grief.
Yeah.
And their religious beliefs played a huge role in shaping public perception.
They were Seventh-day Adventists.
They were.
And it seemed like their faith became a point of suspicion.
It did.
Rumors about their beliefs?
Oh, there were whispers, dark rituals, even child sacrifice.
Wow.
And this was fueled in part by a book called Evil Angels, which explored a different case involving alleged ritualistic abuse. Now, even though it had nothing to do with the Chamberlain's specific beliefs, it contributed to this cloud of suspicion around them.
So you had this really potent mix of media scrutiny, public prejudice, and questions about the evidence, and this all led to the trial itself.
Right.
What was the outcome?
Well, in 1982, Lindy Chamberlain was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Michael was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact. It was just a devastating outcome for the family. And, you know, Lindy actually gave birth to another daughter while she was in prison.
It's hard to imagine the emotional toll that must have taken on her, giving birth to a child while imprisoned for the murder of another.
Absolutely.
And despite her appeals, the convictions were initially upheld.
Yes, both the federal court and the high court upheld the convictions, leaving Lindy facing a long and uncertain future behind bars. But thankfully, that's not where the story ends. There was a significant turning point in the case with the Morling Report.
Let's dive into that in part 2.
Okay. Yeah, the Morling Report was a big deal. It was like hitting the reset button on the whole case.
Okay.
It came out of a royal commission, a very serious inquiry launched in 1986 to re-examine the Chamberlain's convictions.
So it's basically a top-to-bottom review of everything, the investigation, the trial, the evidence.
Exactly. And it was very critical of how the original investigation and trial were handled. One of the biggest criticisms, I think, was about the forensic evidence, particularly the blood testing.
Right.
Remember how we talked about that alleged blood they found in the car? Well, the report basically said the testing was flawed. And what they thought was blood was actually just a sound-deadening compound. That was a major blow to the prosecution's case. The report also, highlighted the lack of a motive. The prosecution had never really explained why Lindy would have murdered her baby.
Mm-hmm.
And it criticized that heavy reliance on circumstantial evidence and how public opinion had really been allowed to influence the case.
It sounds like the report exposed some pretty serious problems with the whole case against the Chamberlains.
Yeah, it did. And then there's one more thing. Remember how we talked about those later dingo attacks?
Yeah.
Well, during the Royal Commission, this key piece of evidence came to light that had been overlooked in the original trial.
Wait, are you talking about Azaria's jacket?
Exactly. The jacket had been missing, and it was found near a dingo lair. This discovery totally shifted the narrative because it provided physical evidence to support the Chamberlain's story.
Right.
It showed that a dingo could have taken Azaria and dragged her away.
Wow.
And it just cast so much doubt on the prosecution's case.
It must have been a relief for the Chamberlains after everything they went through.
Oh, it was huge. The Morling Report, ultimately led to Lindy Chamberlain's release from prison in 1986. And it paved the way for the Chamberlain's convictions to be officially overturned in 1988. Then in 2012, a final inquest was held, and that officially ruled Azaria's death a dingo attack.
It's amazing how one piece of evidence, that jacket, could just change everything. But even with their convictions overturned and the official ruling confirming their story, were there still people who had doubts?
Unfortunately, yeah. Some people, even a policeman who was actually at Uluru that night, still maintained that there had to be some kind of human involvement. They stick to their theories, even in the face of all this evidence.
It makes you think, how can you know what to believe when even the experts disagree?
That's the challenge of this case, and any complex case, really. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to evaluate the evidence and consider different perspectives and just be willing to adjust our beliefs as new information comes to light.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the emotion of a story, especially one as tragic as this.
Absolutely. And the media plays a big role in shaping perceptions, right?
It does.
So we have to be really mindful of how narratives are presented, be willing to kind of dig a little deeper.
Speaking of narratives, the Chamberlains' religious beliefs played a huge role in how they were perceived by the public. And I think that's really important to talk about.
It is. At the time, Seventh-day Adventists were often misunderstood, seen as different. And that difference bred suspicion.
Right. Remember all those rumors about their beliefs?
Yeah.
Blood sacrifices and dark rituals?
It's a classic example of how fear and prejudice can take hold, especially when it's amplified by media coverage. Those rumors, even though they were baseless, they added fuel to the fire of public opinion, painted the Chamberlains as outsiders, potentially dangerous.
It's like their faith became a weapon used against them.
It is, and it's a reminder of how easily we otherize those who are different from us and how that can have devastating consequences. And it's important to remember that the Chamberlains have always maintained that their faith was a source of strength, of comfort for them throughout this. They've never wavered in their belief that a dingo took their baby.
It's a powerful lesson. Not just about this case, but about how we approach information, how we form our own judgments.
We have to be cautious about just accepting things at face value, especially in emotionally charged cases like this.
This case, with all its twists and turns, the media frenzy, the flawed investigations, it really makes you wonder, how can we be more critical of the information we consume, especially in these cases that, grab our attention?
That's a great question. I think we need to be aware of our own biases, be willing to challenge our assumptions, and seek out different perspectives. And it's not just about consuming information responsibly. It's also about, recognizing the human impact of these stories.
Yeah, you're right. We can't forget that this is a family that lost a child.
A family that endured unimaginable pain, scrutiny, and injustice. Lindy spent years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Michael faced his own share of accusations and condemnation. Their lives were torn apart by this case.
Yeah, their reputations tarnished.
Yeah.
Even after their names were cleared, that shadow of suspicion lingered.
It did. And it's a reminder that justice, even when it's served, doesn't always erase the scars.
Right.
There's a powerful quote from Lindy Chamberlain. She said, "Truth must be on your side." And I think that just speaks to her resilience, her belief in her innocence, and it highlights the importance of fighting for what's right, even when things seem impossible.
It's amazing, the strength and determination she showed through all of this.
It is.
But even with everything the Chamberlains went through, this case still generates debate today.
Yeah.
There are still questions, aren't there?
There are. Some people still question how a dingo could have removed Azaria's clothing so neatly without causing more damage.
That's a good point. As we talked about earlier, even dingo experts don't agree on that.
Right. And the fact that her body was never found just adds another layer of mystery.
Yeah, it makes it hard to know for sure what happened.
Exactly. And that lack of a body has always fueled speculation. It's hard to completely silence all the doubters. But even with those lingering questions, it's important to remember that the evidence does support the conclusion that a dingo was responsible.
Right. The later cases of dingo attacks, the jacket being found near the lair, those flaws in the forensic evidence, it all points in that direction.
It does. And Chamberlains have always maintained their innocence.
Yeah.
Their story has stayed consistent, and it's been corroborated by the investigations and the scientific evidence.
It's really incredible how much this one case has impacted Australian society.
It really did change Australia. It changed laws, it sparked conversations about dingoes, but more importantly, I think it forced Australians to confront some truths about themselves.
Yeah, it's like holding a mirror up to society.
It is. And the public's reaction to their story, to their demeanor, their religious beliefs, it revealed some unsettling things about Australian society at the time.
You mean underlying prejudices?
Yeah.
Biases?
Yeah.
A distrust of those who are different?
Exactly. And the media, unfortunately, often amplified those biases, creating this climate of fear and suspicion. The way Lindy was portrayed was unfair. It was like she was being punished for not fitting into this mold of how a grieving mother should behave.
Right.
It's heartbreaking. It's a stark reminder of how quickly prejudice can take root and how we otherize those who are different.
It's also a story about resilience, about fighting for the truth even when the whole world is against you.
Yes. Lindy never gave up, and she prevailed because of her legal team, the support she had, and of course, new evidence. It's a testament to the fact that justice, it can triumph, even if it's slow and imperfect.
It's a story of hope and perseverance.
But it's also a cautionary tale.
What do you mean?
Imagine how people would react to this today with social media and instant judgments. It's scary to think how fast misinformation and prejudice could spread.
That's a chilling thought. It really shows how important it is to be careful about what we see and read.
We can't just believe everything we see or hear.
The Azaria Chamberlain case really shows how a story can be manipulated, how facts can be twisted, how public opinion can be influenced by fear and prejudice.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to be informed, to be thoughtful, and to be careful about what we believe and what we share.
Because these stories we tell, the stories we believe, have such an impact on the world around us.
Absolutely. They shape how we see each other. They influence our decisions.
This case really shows that. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about society,
Yeah.
and that power of narrative.
While the Chamberlain case is in the past, its echoes are still felt today.
Yeah.
It reminds us to be vigilant, to be compassionate, and to never stop seeking the truth.
Very well said. It's just incredible, how one case can really just reveal so much about society, about our fears, our prejudices, our capacity for compassion and judgment.
It's a story that just keeps resonating. I think it speaks to something deeper, within us.
Yeah. And in the age of social media, where information spreads like wildfire and opinions are formed instantly,
Oh, absolutely.
I think the lessons of the Chamberlain case are even more relevant than ever.
If the media had that much power back then,
Yeah.
imagine the influence it has now. I mean, we're just bombarded with information. It's hard to know what's real and what's not, what's true, what's speculation.
It's like everyone's got a megaphone, right?
Right.
And it's easy to get lost in all the noise.
It is. That's why it's so important to develop those critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
We talked about it. Question our assumptions, consider different perspectives, and just be wary of those sensationalized stories, the ones that play on our emotions.
Right, because those are the stories, the ones that make us angry or scared. Those are the ones that spread the fastest.
Exactly. And those are the stories where we need to be extra careful, be willing to really dig deep and look for the truth.
Yeah. The Azaria Chamberlain case is really the perfect example of how a story can be manipulated, how facts can be twisted, how public opinion can be swayed, by fear and prejudice.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to be informed, to be thoughtful, and to really be careful about the information that we're consuming and sharing.
Because these stories that we tell, the stories that we believe, they have a huge impact on the world around us.
They shape how we see others, they influence our decisions, and they can have consequences.
And this case is proof of that. It makes us confront some pretty uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about society as a whole.
Absolutely.
And that power of narrative.
Yeah, the Chamberlain case, it might be in the past, but its echoes are still felt today.
Yeah.
It reminds us to be vigilant, to be compassionate,
Mm-hmm.
and to never stop seeking the truth.
Well said. Simon and Tom will be reviewing this case in their weekly review on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.